Welcome everyone! Today's game of Bobby Fischer is pretty famous, and it's famous for a reason. This was a complete demolition of a top GM, and if you want a great example of a Kingside attack, then you also want to stick around. Let's start this off. He faced Argentinian GM Oscar Panno, played in Buenos Aires in 1970. Fischer had white and opened with e4, c5, so it looks like we'll get a Sicilian defense. However, after knight to f3 and e6, Fischer played d3. He's not in the mood for a theoretical battle. He wants to play a King's Indian attack. It's a quiet but a sensible setup. White goes g3, bishop g2, knight b to d2, and at some point white wants to gain space with e4, e5. It's a system that's more based on understanding than on memorizing lines. It continued knight to c6, g3, g6. Black's dark squares are now weakened some more, but after bishop to g7 and knight ge7, it's still a reliable setup. Now both sides just played the standard moves, bishop g2, bishop g7, castles, knight g to e7, rook to e1 to support that eventual e4, e5. d6 discourages that move, and here c3 by Fischer. If he cannot go e4, e5 right away, then he'll first go d4 and then e5. That's the plan at least, because black did have a chance to stop that by going e5 himself. And if white is really insistent on playing d4 after bishop to e3 and castles, then he may even get in trouble. If d4 now, then you can see after these trades and bishop to g4, the pressure on d4 is too much and white's even forced to give up his center. Anyway, black didn't play e5, he castled, which isn't bad. However, after d4 and this trade, Panno did make a mistake. He went d5 and he suffered because of that. It was definitely better to put pressure on the d-pawn like this and force Fischer to react. He cannot defend with bishop to e3 because then b2 hangs. And so white's best is to go d5 himself here, and black would be okay. For example, it could go knight to d4, knight to c3, and after this trade, black could take on f3 and go knight to f5, and white doesn't have much. After the game continuation, Fischer got this nagging space advantage after e5, and if black would challenge the e-pawn with f6, then he gets a weak backward pawn on e6. Panno's idea was to play on the queen side, first bishop to d7. He wants to go knight to a5, b5 and stick the knight on c4, but let's see how that turned out. Knight to c3, rook to c8, bishop to f4, Fischer wants to rook on c1. Then, as expected, knight to a5, rook to c1 and b5, but now a very simple move, b3, and that's the end of black's counterplay. It's a bit surprising how little counterplay black gets this game, but it all has to do with white's center pawns and the fact that black doesn't challenge white's center. Panno then wanted to free up the b5 square for his bishop, so b4, knight to e2. This knight will actually get right in the face of black's king, just wait and see. Bishop to b5, queen to d2. Now it's always easier in hindsight, but if I were black, I'd trade my bishop for the knight. Also in general strategy terms, it just makes sense since the game is so closed. Instead, black improved the knight, but now Fischer starts going on the offensive. g4, that does two things. It'll support a pawn storm when white goes for h4, h5, and it frees up the g3 square for the knight. Now, a5, knight to g3, queen to b6. Watch how black's moving pieces away from the king side as Fischer is bringing his pieces to the king side. But there is no counterplay on the queen side, and so Fischer continues as planned. h4, knight to b8. Panno wants to trade rooks, but also be able to move the knight from d7 to f8 if needed. Bishop to h6 plans to trade off and makes the dark squares even weaker. But black didn't trade, he continued to reroute his knight. And so Fischer brought his queen over, basically saying, if you don't want to take my bishop, then I'll try to motivate you. The knight on e7 is now hanging. If black now takes on h6, at least the knight is safe. First though, Panno trades rooks and then takes the bishop, but you'll see that the queen is in a very dangerous position now. Rook to c8 to trade off again. Fischer doesn't really need the rook, so takes. At least the knight can still defend the h-pawn after knight to f8, but actually black is on the verge of a complete collapse. h5 was next. Everything Fischer has done so far makes complete sense. That cannot be said of black's play, and unfortunately it got even worse right now. Panno decided to bring his queen back to defend, but he should have just gone knight to f8, and in case of queen to g5, planning h6 and a mate on g7, then go queen to c7, and the queen is in time to defend. Black's position is still very bad, but at least he's not losing in a couple of moves. Going back to the game, after queen to d8, black in fact does only last a couple of moves. Now, knight to g5, threatening with a check and then mate on f7. Knight f8 defends, but now comes the star move of the game. Bishop to e4 is a brilliant move. Now the bishop also targets black's kingside pawns. Taking is definitely out of the question. After knight takes, knight f6 check is coming, and black even has to sack the queen, otherwise knight takes f7 would be mate. So black didn't take, queen e7 was tried, defending the 7th rank, but now Fischer shows what a real kingside attack is. The first knight came in, taking the first of black's kingside pawns. The h-pawn takes the second, and then the bishop took the final one. Now bishop takes knight and queen takes e6 check, winning the second knight is a threat. So knight to g5, but there is still the knight that Fischer transferred to g3 earlier. Knight to h5 plans a deadly check on f6. Panno stalled a little with knight f3 check and knight h4 check, but after knight takes bishop, knight check, king f7 and queen h7 check, Panno decided enough was enough and resigned, since after king to f8 only move, queen g8 ends the game. Well, if that's not a complete demolition, then I don't know what is. If we briefly go back, it was at this point that Panno made a critical mistake with d5, allowing Fischer to get pawns on both d4 and e5. As we've seen, having a pawn on e5 can be a great asset when going for a kingside attack. Fischer then went for this very straightforward but very effective strategy with g3 and advancing on the kingside. And soon after he played that great bishop to e4 move, he crashed through with his pieces and the h-pawn to finish this great game. So hopefully you've enjoyed this game too. If you did, please do me a favor and like the video, and do consider subscribing to the channel. There's another great game tomorrow, so I'll be seeing you guys again soon, and take care.